All right, there we go. Um, so Tim wanted me to come and talk to you something that I was passionate about. And so what that led to was, of course, something bird related, although I'm really into all critters and insects and all sorts of things. And I think it's really cool you guys have this Backyard Naturalist series that essentially tries to highlight ways in which we can, look around what's around our backyards and maybe how we can do things that are better for biodiversity and the natural world. So in this case, I'm going to talk today about better lives for backyard birds. And birds are always in the news and have been again today, in recent weeks and months. And so the big headlines you probably heard about recently were, this big study that was published on the decline of the North American avifauna. So this was published in a big journal called Science, and it had some big numbers in it. Essentially, we lost a third of our bird population since 1970, the last 50 years. It's almost 3 billion breeding birds that have been gone. 1 out of every 4 or so that have vanished. And those are stories or numbers, at least, that are corroborated by a lot of folks who were around in 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s who remember there being a lot more birds on the landscape. And this was the first time numbers were really placed on those declines. And the study was based on a lot of different bird surveys, some of which were citizen science surveys. And it was not surprising to a lot of people who work with birds, who watch birds, but I think especially to the folks who are less in tune with the birds and the natural world around them, it was a real eye-opener, I think, to the declines we're seeing. And it wasn't just one species or one group of birds that's really driving it. I mean, just some of the examples, grassland birds are one of the fastest declining groups, 53% population loss in our grasslands. We've lost so much grassland habitat, as many of you know. Meadowlarks, kind of the staple of our grassland systems across the continent. 3 out of 4 eastern meadowlarks lost in the last 50 years. Aerial insectivores, we were just talking about nighthawks, and those are one type of aerial insectivore, which has seen declines as well. Almost a third of populations lost, so things like swallows and martins, things that eat bugs while they're flying around. And barn swallows are a really good example. They're a common species throughout all but the heavily forested counties of the state, and 2 out of 5, or about 40% of barn swallows, have been lost. And just migratory birds in general, if we consider all the species that move south in the fall and come back in the spring, 2.5 billion migratory birds lost in a half century, including some familiar ones like Baltimore Orioles. Again, about 40% declines. Other common species, ones you probably see in your backyard, maybe even now, or certainly in the next month or two, dark-eyed junco populations have declined by half in that time period. We lost almost 100 million white-throated sparrows in that time. And wood thrushes, for kind of one of our more common forest birds, especially across the southern half of the state, declined 60% in that time. And those are just a few examples. Even red-winged blackbirds have declined greatly over the years. So here's kind of a graphic that came out in a recent report that kind of summarizes things by groups in these declines. And you can see 34% decline in grassland birds. Many of our shorebirds are in trouble, especially those breeding in the Arctic, which is the majority of them. Sea ducks, eastern forest birds declining, our desert or arid land birds. And then there's this whole suite of species that the State of the Birds report, which you can find at stateofthebirds.org, declared as tipping point species. These are birds that have declined 50% in the last 50 years. Things like snowy owls, for example. There's great declines in many of those species, 67% loss. On the flip side, there are some exceptions, and the water bird world is probably the biggest one. Duck populations, geese populations, swan populations generally going up. Most of that has to do with our policy and financial investments in those, and things like the North American Wildlife Conservation Act, duck stamps, and things that are putting more of the wetland resource on the landscape. And another good example, I threw this bald eagle picture in to remind us, are many of our raptors have really increased over this 50-year time period. They used to be shot legally or illegally. They were viewed very unfavorably as predators, or DDT impacts obviously played a big role. And then you had things like the banning of DDT and in the Endangered Species Act and other things that protected these birds. And you've seen a real comeback for bald eagles, peregrine falcons, a lot more Cooper's hawks on the landscape. Merlins are another really good example, and many of our raptors, not all of them, but many. So why do these declines really matter? Why should we be concerned? And I love this quote that comes from, I believe this is an Audubon staffer, but birds are important because they keep systems in balance. They reduce pests, pollinate plants, they disperse seeds, scavenge carcasses, and recycle nutrients back into the earth. So getting at the ecological functions of birds, right? Birds play a big role in our ecosystem at controlling many of the pests that would damage our crops and such, pollination, scavenging, and so forth. But they also feed our spirits, marking for us the passage of the seasons, moving us to create art and poetry, inspiring us to flight, and reminding us that we are not only on, but of this earth. And so there's that emotional connection that we have with birds. This inspired by their flying around, these long migrations they make, the way they come and go throughout the seasons, that first red-winged blackbird and that lift we get when we hear it singing, and so forth. And so it's these beautiful songs that we hear, and the beautiful plumages like this American redstart, spectacular appearances of something like an almost entirely white snowy owl, common loons, and that bold red eye and black and white speckled back with that song that's so representative of the North Woods and its lakes. Golden-winged warblers, not only beautiful to look at, but Wisconsin plays a very important role, hosting essentially a quarter of the breeding population in the entire world for this species. Pine grosbeaks, even in the wintertime. We don't have many birds around in the winter, but we get these winter finches, and some of our resident birds stick around, and they're beautiful, they're stunning. And sometimes they're right in our own hometowns or backyards. Common species like wood ducks. I think we wood ducks for granted. They're not uncommon to see, but they're incredibly striking, the drakes. And then something as simple as a blue jay. This is a close-up of the tail and the wing of a blue jay. Talk about a bird that we take for granted. But it's these visuals, these amazing appearances and songs that I think really resonates with so many people. But the other fact is, birds are everywhere, right? Unlike so many other taxa or species groups, they're not hard to see. When you go to the grocery store, you're probably going to see birds. When you walk out into your yard, you're probably going to see birds. And certainly if you go out into the wilds, you're going to go to a park or a refuge, you're going to see birds. And so birds are everywhere, and I think that's a big reason why we have such a connection with them, and in part then why it matters so much that these declines are occurring. And so that's the kind of ecological side, and that's the the emotional side, but there's also an economic component, right? And so there has not been a more recent study than this one from the Fish and Wildlife Service. The last one came out in 2011. It was slated to be done again during the pandemic years and then got tabled. But essentially, the most recent data we have, and I'm sure these numbers have gone up, 47 million bird watchers, roughly 20% of the US population, and they're generating big chunks of cash, $107 billion in total industry output related to, trips and equipment and things like that. lots of jobs and lots of tax revenue that stems from these. So birding is a big business, especially in the communities in which there are opportunities. And as such, there's another important role, that birds play, and why it makes them important that we conserve them. So why are these declines? We won't dwell too much on this, and I don't think it will come as any surprise to many of you that a big reason is habitat loss. Now, this is a picture of a forest getting cleared, which isn't in itself an entirely bad thing, depending on how that stand is managed. But the loss of habitat, especially many of our forest systems, is a big player in bird population declines, both during the breeding season here and in the wintering areas, which may be a little bit further south or maybe very far south, as far as South America. When we think of habitat loss too, we should also be thinking about our agricultural systems, grasslands, and just the conversion to various types of agriculture, essentially to sustain humans, right? Or whether it be through livestock or direct food sources. And then, of course, there's development. Just there's more and more people. There's more and more of us. There's fewer places to go. And so birds continue to lose habitat to the growing human population. And that's obviously true beyond birds as well. So now beyond that habitat, what are some of these other sources of habitat loss? This is a graphic that comes from a study that was done about 8 years ago now. And this was essentially a study of studies. So they looked at all kinds of literature, and then they made some extrapolations and came up with these different anthropogenic impacts or sources of mortality on bird populations in the United States and Canada. So if we look past habitat loss, what are the main things that are causing birds to decline? And the number one factor are outdoor cats. And so that includes feral cats, but it also includes homeowners' cats that they let outside or let free range. 2.4 billion birds per year just in the US alone are lost to outdoor cats. So that's a huge factor, and we'll talk more about that. The second leading component are building windows, and that includes kind of city skyscrapers and large buildings with lots of grass, businesses, things like that. But it also includes the far greater number of residential homes as well. And that estimates about 600 million birds per year lost to window collisions with buildings. Then there's a whole suite of other factors that are all kind of collisions with automobiles, collisions with power lines, collisions with communication towers, getting electrocuted, collisions with wires, and then at the last one there, wind turbines are also a collision factor. And then you'll see that last one, agricultural chemicals or pesticides, for short. There's no estimate. At the time this study was done, that was not a factor that was could be enumerated, and that's probably still true to some extent. But you can see cats and building windows are the really big ones, and then you have this slew of other ones that have varying levels of not negligible impacts, but a lesser extent, but certainly of cumulative concern. So the agricultural chemicals, I mentioned there was nothing there to really enumerate that, and that's still true, but there have been some recent studies on the impacts of pesticides and such. These neonicotinoids that you've heard probably in the news, especially relating to pollinators like bumblebees and such. There's been studies that show the impacts of those insecticides on migration. And so in this case, it was white-crowned sparrows. These white-crowned sparrows that were exposed to the insecticides took in less food. That meant that they weighed less. That meant that they were less likely to leave on migration because they're not of suitable body condition. And then that delay in their migration has all kinds of impacts on whether they get a good territory, whether they're there at the right time for the appropriate food resources. whether they get the best habitats, things like that. There are more and more studies coming out that look at the direct impacts of, excuse me, some of these pesticides on bird populations. But what we know now is those impacts are surely far greater than we currently know or can quantify. And obviously, some of those are direct impacts, like the insecticide may directly kill a bird that eats, say, a seed coated with a neonicotinoid. But many of those are indirect impacts related to the insect prey that the birds rely on during their lives. And then the other factor is climate change. And so that climate change was not included in the study. Obviously difficult to come up with numeric answers or descriptions of the impacts. But obviously climate change is playing a big role. It already is in some ways. It's projected to do so even further if things continue the way they are. In some cases, like the map on the left, the bobolink, it shows the red is a habitat loss, and then the light blue, which you might have a hard time seeing, is habitat gained. So you can see that's a bird that is going to shift north with the climate change projections into southern Canada, but it's also going to lose the overall amount of habitat available to it. And that's true across many species. And another big concern with climate change are these phenological mismatches, meaning insect hatches occurring at different times because of the temperatures and the humidities, and that in turn, the birds not responding quick enough with, say, the timing of their migration, not being able to adapt or evolve fast enough, and you end up with a mismatch that that big hatch of caterpillars takes place maybe too soon, and by the time a bird has its nest full of young, that biomass of caterpillars is no longer available. So if you want information on climate change, head over to the Audubon website. They have a website, Survival by Degrees. They're kind of the leading kind of national authority on climate change impact on birds. You find a few different reports and you can investigate species and regions and things like that. But clearly climate change is playing a big role and will continue to do so. So how do we change kind of the trajectory of all this? Because it kind of sounds like a doom and gloom story, and so I apologize for that. So what do we kind of have to do? And there's multiple levels, and this isn't the only way this could be binned out, but policy-wise, things need to happen at kind of federal and state levels, passing laws, things that worked before, endangered species laws, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, continue to keep those protections for birds alive and enhance those, but also policies that then directly provide funding or result in funding. So things like I mentioned NAWCA, the North American Wildlife Conservation Act, or the Farm Bill. So investing, these are essentially incentive programs that are paying users to keep or enhance habitat for birds. And then there's partnerships. Partnerships play a huge role in how we move forward. No one's going to be able to do any of this alone. And thankfully, we already have a lot of great partnerships. To mention the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative, which is now the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership. That's an example. At a regional level, we have these things called joint ventures that have states talking to each other, and how do we get more habitat on the ground for birds? So these partnerships will be key in bringing birds back. And planning, it's kind of maybe not as fun to talk about planning, but we need to come up with strategies, right? Which species are the priorities? Where are the priorities? Which habitats are the priorities? Where can we get the biggest bang for our buck? So essentially prioritizing habitat, species, areas where we can have the biggest impact for bird populations. And then lastly, and this is finally what we're here to talk about today, but personal action. There's such a huge percentage of the land mass is private, right? It's not publicly owned land where Fish and Wildlife, where the U.S. Forest Service is going to save birds. A lot of it is going to have to happen on private lands, and that's where all of us need to kind of come in and make a difference, take some action. And so what I would like to talk about for the rest of our time is some of the things that we can do around our backyards to help birds. And one of the points I want to make is, backyard means a lot of different things to a lot of people. I'm here in northern Wisconsin. I have 14 acres, which is kind of a medium amount relative to a lot of my neighbors who might own 40s or 80s or something like that. But I have a relatively big property. I have a lot of opportunity. It's pretty wild, things like that. But many of you don't. Many folks live in towns. Many people have urban backyards. It might be a postage stamp, so to speak. And that's okay. We can all make differences at different scales, all right, with different levels of action. Obviously, you're not going to put in big ponds in your urban backyard, and that's okay. But maybe it just takes one tree, or maybe it takes one window that you're protecting, something like that, that can really make a difference. So keep in mind that these things apply to everybody, just maybe at a different scale for each individual. So when that study came out, this graphic you see up here was very popular. It was essentially trying to spawn some action, right? It was, hey, birds are declining, things are bad. If things keep going the way they are, it's going to get worse. But here are some things you can do to help. And kept it simple. You'll see there's 7 actions here. You can Google actions to help birds, and you'll find all kinds of lists from every organization out there, top 6, top 10, whatever. And that's okay. A lot of them overlap, and then there's a few that are kind of different. And we'll talk about a few of these. I probably won't make it to all of them. So when I ask people usually, and maybe this comes to mind for you too, if we were in a room together, I would ask you this directly, but how can you help birds at home? The first thing I usually get from my audience is feeders. And that's kind of true. And I got a slide in here that talk about feeders, but believe it or not, feeders are they're supplemental. Most birds, and there are exceptions in extreme cold, in storms, certain species, where it does make a matter of life and death potentially, or at least help a bird through. Most cases, it's supplemental. In most cases, birds are visiting, it's for our entertainment, all right? They get something out of it, but it's not critical. In most cases, not all cases. So I tell people, if you want to attract more birds, if you want to feed birds, you need to be feeding them the insects and the native plant sources that they require, all right? Because insects, you want the creepy crawlies, you want all the caterpillars. These are the primary foods for so many of our birds. Or you want the seeds coming from the native tree species that you plant there, right? So if you want to feed birds, you want to encourage all this other life, all right? Because that is the prey for the vast majority of many of our birds. And obviously not like shorebirds and not raptors and such, but many of our songbirds, many of our backyard birds rely on this, all right? And so especially, they feed on these all times of year. It's a critical fuel they need for migration, but especially during breeding season. This is a hermit thrush that has a mouthful of food, that's going to go back to its nest. The majority of nestling birds to survive need caterpillars, beetles, all those creepy, crawly insects, all right, that's so many people, unfortunately too many people, are trying to get rid of. That's what you want when it comes to bird feeding and attracting birds in your backyard. All right, so how do we kind of improve this insect situation in our yard so that we can attract more birds and help birds during their migrations or breeding season? And this is a white-throated sparrow, also with a mouthful, ready to go to some young. But some simple things you can do, reducing the size of your lawn. And so I'm not saying get rid of your entire lawn, that's just not practical. But make it smaller, take a section of it and convert it, either plant it with native plants or maybe let it go wild, if that's suitable in that case. Set aside sections where you can do less lawn mowing, which does not provide habitat for the majority of birds, and create some sort of habitat, whether it be for pollinators, birds, or otherwise. Remove your invasive species. So that's an active thing that we need to do. So for example, my property, I don't have too many nasty invasive problems, but I do have buckthorn around the perimeter from the old farmstead that used to be here. So I have to remove buckthorn, and there's a variety of ways you can do that. And I say minimize chemicals because the buckthorn removal is a great example. I spray the buckthorn, but I use it in a very judicious way, and I am very careful, and I really minimize use spot techniques. I wait for the right time of year, those sorts of things. So again, we're not trying to promote extremes where, it's get rid of everything all at once immediately, but take the steps to really minimize and kind of move the scale towards less lawn, invasives being removed, not using pesticides and chemicals to the extent possible, and planting trees, shrubs, forbs, and wildflowers, those sorts of things that are native to your area. Right? And that's a really like the number one way that you can improve the habitat in your yard. So what does that look like? Here's an example of a home where you've got a lot of lawn and maybe they planted some non-native trees. The lawn takes all kinds of maintenance, whether it's chemicals or frequent mowing. The non-native tree really does not host any insects because insects here have not evolved with that species of tree, so they don't feed on the leaves or reside in the bark. And as such, there's not food in those non-native trees for birds. And then maybe there's a whole garden full of, pretty plants, but they're not very effective at attracting insects and bumblebees and things like that, butterflies and so forth. So this is what we want to kind of shy away from. And then we want to move towards something where we've added a variety of native tree species, native shrubs, gardens that contain more natives and attract seeds and insects and spiders. And we've really filled in the area so there's not as much lawn, all those sorts. So what are these native plants? What should you put out there? Some of you have probably seen this book, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Palmy. He's kind of a leading expert on native plants. If you haven't read his stuff, I would recommend. He's got a number of books. He's got presentations that are online. You can watch all kinds of stuff. But this is a good graphic from his book about which species host the most lepidopteran species. So butterfly and moth larvae, essentially caterpillars. What's going to get you the most caterpillars and the most birds that eat insects, which is a vast majority of them. Oak is number one. Willows are spectacular. Cherries and plums are great. Birches, especially if you're up north. Poplar, cottonwood, blueberries, maples, and all down the line. So this is a great example of, the powerhouses of the insect world and what you can put. So maybe if you have a small backyard, just one oak tree out there can make a huge difference and be kind of that magic tree that attracts all of your migrating birds. So be sure to check out these resources. There are other places for this. And I've got a couple links here coming up, but I wanted to point out that in addition to plants that draw in the insects, many of our natives will produce fruits in the late summer and the fall that are really great for birds. So this is a cedar waxwing chowing down on some service berries. They're also called duneberries. It's a good early season one. Then cherries are another really good fruit. And you saw that they were also one of the powerhouses of in supporting lepidopteran larvae. And so cherries are a really great choice, albeit occasionally messy at times. This is a hermit thrush eating black cherry berries. And then some of the shrubs. This is an American elderberry that I have in my yard. That's a Philadelphia vireo. And I get all kinds of stuff that comes into my elderberry and eats those. So you can think about fruit sources later on in the summer or late summer and fall as well. lot of other choices. So where can you get some of these? If you go to our DNR page on native plants, so that's the exact website there, but if you just go to dnr.wi.gov and then the keyword system we have, if you put in native plants, the first hit you'll get is a page that has all kinds of resources on native plants. And one of them includes a link to a PDF I put together on 10 great native trees, shrubs, and plants for birds. And not all 10 of them will work for you. Some are maybe more suited for the north, some for the south, some may not work because you have a very sandy soil, and this is a species that requires kind of a heavy wet soil, whatever. But you get the idea. There's some ideas in here for some things that are really good for planting for birds. And lastly, Audubon also has a website you can go to. It's called their Native Plants Database, and you can punch in your zip code and it will send you to a page. This is just a little example here of all sorts of native plants for your area and what soils they like and kind of what birds that they benefit. So go check that out if you would like to get some more ideas on native plants. So in other words, there's a lot of resources out there for finding out what native plants work. And it's a lot of fun kind of going through and then going to your maybe local source for native plants and getting them in the ground and watching all the critters respond in a positive way. All right, so that's the native plants. And I kind of was a downer on bird feeders to start, but I want to circle back to them because there is some value to feeders, and you don't have to tell me I have tons of feeders. I spend a lot of time, money, and effort maintaining them. A lot of it is for the joy of it, but like I said, in some cases, it does truly help the birds. And so a few tips for those of you with feeders, and this is very broad, but the single best seed you can offer is black oil sunflower seed. If you can get it without the shells, so where it's just the hearts or the meats, then that'll reduce the mess you have, but it's also much more expensive. Also put out Niger, which is also called thistle. That's really good for the small finches. White millet is a kind of a small round white seed that's very good for the sparrows and the doves. So I put a lot of that out during migration when the sparrows are moving through. Suet is a great source, very fatty. Woodpeckers, nuthatches, blue jays, all kinds of birds eat suet, especially in the colder weather when they need a higher fat content. Same with peanut. Peanuts are very popular. Unfortunately, also quite spendy and will attract squirrels and jays quite a bit. But birds, especially the woodpeckers and nuthatches, really love peanuts. Avoid those generic mixes for the most part. When you go to the store, the ones that got them all mixed and they say, oh, it's a magic, mix of seeds. Generally, those have a lot of junk in them that won't get eaten. And there's a reason those are cheaper to buy. So I tend to avoid those and just buy the individual types. And then you can put out what you want. Make sure you're deterring your squirrels with baffles. I have had the most success by using a single pole to hold the feeders and then a cone type baffle that hangs down between the feeder and the ground, and that keeps squirrels from climbing up. That's been most for me. Avoid the 3 to 30 foot danger zone. And so what does that mean? That means you want to keep birds away from the windows. And the way to do that, or at least one way to help, is to put your feeder either right next to the windows, like on the window, within 3 feet, or more than 30 feet away. If you get into that danger zone, when the birds flush, they can really hit those windows with high speed, not have enough time to judge that it's not really a place to go. So try to avoid putting your feeders that distance away from your house window. And then lastly, if you have feeders, you have a responsibility to clean them regularly, reduce disease. If we're going to artificially concentrate birds in the same places, we need to clean very regularly to keep things like conjunctivitis or salmonella at a minimum. So you want to use a soapy water and a 10% bleach solution, like every week. And certainly if you see signs of disease, then do it more frequently and keep up on that so we can keep our birds safe. All right, a few other habitat features to mention that you can use to help birds in your backyard. Water is very underappreciated as a way to attract and help birds. Many people think about feeders, they don't think as much about water. Now, water could be as simple as a dish of water or one of those bird baths on a pedestal. That's fine. Could be something a little more elaborate, like one of these fountains that you buy, at kind of a Home Depot or something, or maybe you install a small pond that has a pump that generates recycling water, kind of like a goldfish pond idea. Or maybe you have something more elaborate, like what you hear in this picture. Or maybe you go something even higher, like what's in my background here, which are one of 2 ponds I put in on my property through a program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called Partners for Fish and Wildlife. And that's a bigger example if you have the acreage to do it. But any level that you can put water out, especially in kind of the dry times, hot dry times in like midsummer through early fall, can be really, really time to attract birds. And believe it or not, heated water dishes in the winter are spectacular, especially if you live in a place where water's otherwise tough to access, like up in my area where it's all either frozen or it's snow. Birds really come into the water. Now, this doesn't look very sightly, but believe it or not, this is a great addition to a backyard if you have the capabilities. It's just a brush pile. As humans, we love clearing brush, which in itself is not necessarily a good thing. But if we do, then we tend to like burn it or discard it, or what am I going to do with it? Well, brush piles are great, and it creates tremendous shelter, especially if you're lacking other types of shrubs around your yard. So just pile up the brush, and the more airspace you can put in there, the better. Birds are going to go hide in there. It's an escape from predators. It's a good thermal cover, whether it's too hot or too cold. And it's just habitat for a lot of the species that may frequent your feeders: cardinals, sparrows, chickadees, especially in tough weather conditions. So consider a brush pile. Another habitat feature to consider would be some other type of dense cover in the form of like evergreens or conifers. Again, maybe you don't have much space, but maybe one spruce tree or one pine tree or one fir can really make a difference. Provides roosts for birds overnight, provides really great thermal cover during cold days and especially during storms. So think about how you can add more conifer to your backyard landscape. Snags, again, as humans, we tend to get rid of dead trees and we think, oh, those are no good. Now, in some cases, if it's kind of a threat to fall over and so a safety concern, then sure, that's something to be removed. But if you have the capability to leave snags and essentially dead wood standing, you're going to host a lot of critters. You're going to get woodpeckers and chickadees and nuthatches. You might get flying squirrels and or if you've got big holes out there, maybe you get something even cooler if you're in the north, like a fisher or something like that. And lastly, nest boxes. Nest boxes can be a good way to help certain species of birds. Bluebirds, for example, are certainly one that have benefited from our bluebird, our nest box programs. But other species too, chickadees, nuthatches, swallows, things like that can really benefit from nest boxes, provided they're maintained and kept free of or maybe set up in a way to reduce predation. So for example, this nest box is sitting on a tree. It may be a little more accessible to nest predators like snakes and such, whereas if you can put it standalone on a pole, maybe with some type of baffle on it, then that will keep things like snakes and raccoons from getting to it. All right, so those are a few of the, well, more than a few of the habitat features that you can add to your yard. Let's move to a different threat. If you're going to attract all these birds, right? Because now if you do those things, you're going to have birds kind of flying all over, right? Well, now you've got to make sure we reduce our window collisions. So we have that responsibility to not kind of create a sink, attracting birds. Maybe there's a fruit tree right next to the house. I hear about this a lot. And then birds come to eat the fruits and then they fly into the windows. So we really need to work on the window collision issue. Remember, 600 million birds per year in the US alone die of window collisions. And a lot of those are the 2, 3, 4, or 5 birds that hit windows at residential backyards. And it happens to everybody. We've all heard that thud. I hear it. You know, none of us are immune to it, but we have to do our best to reduce the impacts here. So how do we do that? And when I ask people this, a lot of times I hear about the hawk silhouette. And unfortunately, the hawk silhouette does not work. All right. So if you have a hawk silhouette or you're thinking about this is like a peregrine falcon shape, one big kind of silhouette or sticker or something on the window is not effective. It does not scare the birds away, and it leaves too much of the window uncovered. So what we need to do is other methods on the outside of the windows that cover a greater proportion of the window. And the general rule of thumb is about like a 2 by 4 inch rule. So where you don't want to leave more than 2 inches wide, 4 inches tall, that kind of thing. And some have even said 2 by 2. So be thinking you want something that's more of like a grid to the extent you can. So these are kind of 2 products that are maybe on the leading edge of both effectiveness and accessibility for being able to use on your windows. On the left is something called an Acopian bird saver. You can make these at home or you can buy them, but essentially it's creating an attachment across the top of the window that then hooks in some cord, like a paracord, that hangs down the window spaced every few inches apart. And that really breaks up the reflection, and the research has demonstrated that these very effectively reduces collisions. And if they're untethered at the bottom, then what you have is the wind blowing a little bit, and there's movement there too. And that also helps to keep birds from hitting the window. So you can go online and look those up and either make them yourself. Believe it or not, I found some old cord and I just have some duct taped to the top of my window, which is a complete hack job, but it works. And it has lasted for a while, and I'll just replace it when the time comes. The other source are these things called feather friendly. In this case, they're dots. There's other patterns. And it doesn't matter that they're dots. They can be any kind of pattern on the outside. But you can see on that picture on the right, they're spaced very closely. So it fills up the window much, much more. And that's like a film that you're putting on the outside. So I think it's featherfriendly.com, but you can just Google feather friendly birds or something like that. And you'll get a source for being able to get these for your windows, right? So very, very effective and relatively simple solutions, right? ABC bird tape is the same idea. Bird tape is just a film you're putting on the outside. ABC stands for American Bird Conservancy. They are one of the leading entities in kind of the continental or really international charge for bird conservation. So they're doing a lot of great work, and they're kind of one of the authorities on window collision. So if you go to their website, abc.org/glass collisions, you will get a series of resources, whether it's homes and existing buildings or big architecture or various legislation. You will find all kinds of sources for preventing bird window collisions from ABC's glass collisions page. And you folks in Milwaukee are no stranger to that topic with the work of Bird City and Brian Lenz and the Milwaukee Bucks Stadium. Another good resource is called FLAP, Fatal Light Awareness Program. And I think it's just flap.org if I remember right, but they have a lot of, I think they're Canadian based, Ontario, but a lot of great information on preventing window collisions. So check that out too if this is something where you're looking for ideas. Okay, so that's the window issue. Cats are a big one. As you saw, more than 4 times higher mortality than the next leading factor, which are windows. 2.4 billion birds per year in the US alone. And not surprisingly, this is a pretty contentious issue. You have many folks who are passionate about cats, they love cats, and anything negative about cats, they don't want to hear it. They think cats are natural predators on the landscape, and that's kind of where the issue lies. Is they're not a native species. Birds did not evolve alongside house cats, and many other critters did not either. And so they're really a domesticated animal, and as such, when they're roaming and eating high numbers of birds, it is a problem from an ecological standpoint, and you can see clearly having an impact on bird populations when you're eating that many birds per year collectively. Now, I have 2 cats. I like cats, and my cats stay inside. It's safer for them, less disease. They don't get hit by cars. I've got bears and fishers and bobcats running around. So I don't have to worry about them getting eaten by some of the native predators we have. So the American Bird Conservancy really pushed this Cats Indoors program starting many years ago now. And frankly, it's just kind of struggled. The science is very clear on this topic, but it's very much a social issue, and it has been a challenge. So again, American Bird Conservancy is a leading resource on lots of information on cats, so you can check out their page. Just type in ABC cats, something like that, and you'll get a number of different topics here. All I can say is I really encourage you to keep cats indoors to help bird populations. If you want to get your cat outside, a couple options. One is the kind of a leash and taking your cat for a short walk, and these are becoming more popular with harnesses and so forth. But also growing in interest are these what are called catios, so kind of a patio for cats. And that's what you see here on the left. It's an outdoor space that's caged such that there's no chance for interaction between the cat and many of our native wildlife population. So if you want to get your cat some fresh air, a catio would be a really good choice, if especially if they don't really like the leash. Okay, so that cat topic could be a whole nother talk sometime, but just kind of give you the brief overview. Given the time that we have. Another one, believe it or not, here's someone out maybe on their catio. This looks more like a patio, but could be a catio. It looks like they're enjoying their morning cup of coffee, watching the birds in the backyard. And believe it or not, that coffee and the choice you make for it can really have an impact on many of our bird population. Let me see. So many of our bird populations, you probably noticed this, head south for the winter, right? And you think about things like orioles and hummingbirds and warblers and tanagers and buntings, all these colorful summer species that we love so much. So many of them head down into the tropics, whether it's Central America or South America, to spend the colder months, right? And what happens down there will then in turn impact their populations here. So obviously, if they go south and their habitat isn't there at all, then they're going to have a hard time surviving in a suboptimal place in the wintering grounds. But even so, less extreme, if they get there and the habitat quality isn't good, maybe there's some trees around and such, but maybe the quality of habitat isn't great. And maybe they survive the winter, but maybe their body condition isn't quite as good. Maybe they're not as fit when they start that long migration of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles back to the north. That in turn will affect their ability during the spring and summer to get back here on time, to build a nest, find a mate, to raise their young. So in turn, that might lead to lower productivity during the summertime. So it's important that we think about this full life cycle conservation model. And by that, we mean the bird's entire life cycle throughout the year, not just the few months when it's up here with us during the breeding season. And so that's where our choice of coffee comes in. Start here on the left. Most coffee that you drink is grown in the sun. And so to grow it in the sun, trees are cut. All right, the habitat is opened up. Essentially, you move in, you clear cut it, you grow the coffee bushes in the bright sunshine, and that gives you your sun-grown coffee. Unfortunately, at the same time, it's removed habitat for the majority of bird species, both the resident birds on the wintering grounds as well as many of our neotropical migrants. Whereas if we move over to the right, there is coffee that can be grown in the shade. And this shade grown coffee, I'm not an expert on exactly what it takes to make that work, or especially from a business model, but it can be done, it is done, and this bird-friendly shade-grown coffee gets us coffee, and it maintains habitats for many of these bird species. So what you want to do is look for this little logo, bird-friendly, related to your coffee purchases. And bird-friendly is a certification that's provided through the Smithsonian Institute. Smithsonian has become kind of the lead entity on coffee certification and bird-friendly coffee designations, right? So if you can, go to the Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee website, and you'll find sources for bird-friendly coffee. I think Birds and Beans is a really popular brand. You can buy that online, but buying the shade-grown coffee, you can, every time you have a cup, you're saving some portion of the habitat in Central and South America, which I think we can all agree is a good thing. All right, a few other things to wrap up here. So one of them is to donate. That's another way that we can help our declining bird populations. Maybe, we all have different roles to play in this, right? And so donating to a local cause can be a great way. There are, for example, the Bird Protection Fund gives money out to priority bird conservation projects. It's managed through the Natural Resource Foundation. You can donate to that. One of the projects they give money to is called the Neotropical Flyways Project. It's funneling money down into Central and Northern South America to protect birds there. So that's a great way to have an impact on bird populations when they're not here in our neck of the woods. You can participate in things. And so I'll talk a little bit about citizen science here later, but not so much science in this case, but the Great Wisconsin Birdathon is a fundraiser for the Bird Protection Fund. And that's coming up again here, April 15th through June 15th. Go grab some friends, go birding for a day, raise some money through friends and family, and have that help birds in Wisconsin and beyond. So put that on your radar screen for the upcoming April through June. You don't have to be an expert birder to participate. The important thing is that you go out and you have fun and you raise some money while doing it. Donate, participate, advocate. And there's lots of different ways to advocate for birds, but highlighting one of them here, we have this great program in Wisconsin, the Bird City Wisconsin program. Many of you are probably familiar with it. The map on the left is maybe not perfectly up to date, but it's close, of all the Bird City communities that we have. And you can see the Milwaukee area is pretty chock full of bird-friendly communities, and that's fantastic. But maybe you have a cabin up north, or maybe you know friends or relatives in some part of the state where the community is not. And it's a great way to engage with local leaders and get them to take actions that benefit birds, either through habitat or education and awareness, and so forth. Bird City, Wisconsin. And then lastly, one of those simple actions is citizen science. Participating in things like Christmas bird count is a great example. Or there's a federal breeding bird survey that is extremely important across the continent that relies on volunteer bird watchers to get it done. We just had our Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas, and that finished in 2019, and that used over 3,000 citizen scientists. So I think many of you at the Urban Ecology Center are familiar with this notion of community science, citizen science, and utilizing the expertise of our citizens to do great things. And as someone who works statewide, it's extremely important to me. I cannot deploy staff or resources around the state. Most of that can only happen at kind of a smaller local scale. So for me to be able to get volunteers to do owl surveys or to participate in the Atlas, around the entire state is really critical for us to understand the resource out there and raise any red flags if populations are in trouble. Now, the simplest way from your backyard, especially, that you can contribute as a citizen scientist to help stave off bird population declines is through eBird. And hopefully some of you are using this already. eBird.org/WI just takes you to kind of the Wisconsin doorway into the whole system. But this is essentially an online platform for reporting your bird sightings from wherever you are, whether it's your backyard, whether it's a national park. You can do it 10 times a day if you want, or you can do it once a month, whatever you're comfortable with. But it's a fantastic resource for learning about birds and making sure that your sightings count for conservation. So the basic premise is on the left here. You enter a checklist. I traveled, I was out for an hour and 20 minutes. I was at my house. I went 0.5 miles. Here's all the birds I saw and the numbers that I saw them. So it's a basic checklist format. And then one of the outcomes, or the most popular outcome or output, are these maps. And so I think this is, I think I put in nighthawk here. Yeah, common nighthawk, excuse me, during the summer months. These are all the places where citizen birders reported common nighthawks during the month of July all time. And so you can see, okay, if I want to see a nighthawk, where do I need to go? And these maps are interactive. You can go online and click on those pins and get details of dates and numbers and who saw them and all that kind of stuff. But what this is, it's really like crowdsourcing, right? You're harnessing the power of, what was it, 47 million bird watchers across the state. It's actually global, and it's become a very powerful science tool. And so the eBird science team has really upped its game lately. This is a map for golden wing warbler of like relative density. So the darker the color, the more breeding golden wing warblers there are. And so you can very clearly see, based on eBird data and modeling, where the golden wing warblers are. You can also see that Northwest Wisconsin into the north central part of Minnesota is extraordinarily important to this species. The vast, over half, if not more, maybe closer to 60–70% of the breeding population in the whole world is in this area. And so eBird lets us see that based on the data that folks like you and I are contributing. And they've also taken a step further recently by looking at trends. And so eBird's been around probably only since like 2005, 2010, and that window is when it really started to pick up steam. So in terms of trends, that's not a long time, but it'll continue to build. But even based on that time period that is available, they're already able to derive trends in certain bird populations. So in this case, this is tufted titmouse. The red indicates population declines, blue are population gains over that time period. So you can see as a bird that appears to be declining fairly heavily in the southeast, whereas it's increasing a bit at the northern edge of its range. And we've certainly seen that here in Wisconsin, and the atlas showed that, where we have far more titmice now. Now, maybe some of this is a range shift occurring related to climate change or some other factor. But I got to think the net gain here is a loss of the eastern population of tufted titmouse. So those are the kind of products. I mean, this all comes from just people in their backyards who saw tufted titmice. And that's the kind of power that you can provide to scientists and conservationists just by entering your sightings on a repeated basis. And eBird's fun. It keeps track of all your lists. It's like a journal that you don't lose. All the species you saw, how many checklists, you can click on every checklist, all the photos you've entered. You can go back to the past year and say, when did the last red-winged blackbird get here? Or what was I seeing this time last year? It keeps all of your lists for you. What's my Milwaukee County list? What's my Wisconsin state list? What's my life list? All those things are automatically kept digitally for you through the user. So very simple way. And I would highly encourage you to get started small, okay? Not just with eBird, but with everything. Protect. What's the one window that kills the most birds in your yard? Get it protected, all right? Can I plant 1 or 2 trees somewhere that are really going to benefit birds? Let me do that this spring and summer. I'm going to do one eBird checklist today, and I'm going to try and do that one a day for a week, and just start small. And then you'll find that it gets easier and easier, and you can build into it over time and collectively have an impact on bird populations, while at the same time, hopefully attracting more birds and getting more enjoyment from these critters that we love so much. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.